My name is Helen Cross. For 26 years, I worked as a fraud investigator for a regional bank, the kind of job where you learn to read a person's life in the shape of their spending. You learn what normal looks like. A retired school teacher who buys groceries on Tuesdays and pays her heating bill on the 3rd of every month. A widower who still orders flowers on his late wife's birthday every October, without fail. Normal has a rhythm, and when that rhythm breaks, it almost never breaks for a good reason. I retired 4 years ago. I thought I was done reading other people's bank statements. I was wrong. This is the story of Margaret Doyle, a woman I had known for 11 years before any of this happened, first as a customer, later as a friend, and finally, near the end, as someone I was terrified I hadn't helped fast enough. It's the story of her grandson Tyler, who everyone in her life called a blessing. And it's the story of one bank statement, printed on a Tuesday afternoon, that told me something was very wrong in a house I thought was safe. I want to tell you this story the way I actually lived it, not knowing where it would end. Not certain I was right, second-guessing myself right up until the moment I couldn't anymore. Because that's how it happens. Nobody hands you the truth all at once. You have to go looking for it, one number at a time. Margaret Doyle was 84 years old when this story begins, though to hear her talk, you'd think she was still 40. She had a laugh that filled a room and a memory sharp enough that she could recall the exact interest rate on a certificate of deposit she'd opened in 1987. I liked her the moment I met her. Back when I still worked the branch on Fielding Street and she came in every other Friday to deposit her pension check and complain cheerfully about the price of coffee. Margaret had outlived her husband by 14 years and her only daughter, Carol, by 3. Carol had died of a sudden heart attack at 51, leaving behind one son, Tyler, who was 23 at the time and, by every account I heard, devastated. He moved in with his grandmother within a month, not because anyone made him, because he asked. For a while, it looked like the best possible outcome to an unbearable situation. Margaret had lost her daughter. Tyler had lost his mother. And somehow, in the wreckage of that, they found each other. He drove her to church on Sundays. He learned to cook the dishes Carol used to make, and brought them to Margaret on the anniversary of Carol's death, and cried with her at the kitchen table. And all of this was real. I want to be clear about that from the start, because it matters for what comes later. Grief doesn't lie. What people do with grief sometimes does. 2 years into living with her, Tyler suggested that he take over the boring stuff, her bills, her banking, her medications, the accumulating paperwork of being 84 and recently widowed of a daughter as well as a husband. Margaret agreed without hesitation. She told me about it herself, sitting across from me at her kitchen table on one of my visits after I'd retired and we'd simply stayed friends. I don't have to think about any of it anymore, she said, sounding relieved in a way that, at the time, I mistook entirely for good news. Tyler handles everything. She signed a power of attorney that spring, giving Tyler full authority over her financial affairs. It's an ordinary document. Millions of families use them every year, and the overwhelming majority of the people who hold one do exactly what they're supposed to do, protect the person who trusted them enough to sign it. I want that said plainly, too, because this isn't a story about power of attorney being dangerous. It's a story about what happens when the person holding it decides that trust is a door left unlocked. I remember one visit, not long after Tyler moved in, that I've come back to often since all of this happened. Margaret had asked me over for coffee, and while we sat at her kitchen table, Tyler came down the stairs holding a shoebox full of photographs, Carol's photographs, mostly. Pictures Margaret hadn't looked at since the funeral because she said it hurt too much to open the box alone. He sat between us and went through them one at a time, asking Margaret to tell him who each person was, what year it had been taken, what Carol had been like at 25, at 30, at the age Tyler was now. Margaret cried through most of it, and laughed through the rest. And at one point she reached over and squeezed his hand and said, "I don't know what I would have done without you this year." I believed her completely. I still believe that afternoon was real. I think that's the part of this story people find hardest to sit with, that the tenderness and the theft can come from the same hands. Sometimes in the same season, sometimes even in the same week, for the better part of a year. Nothing about Margaret's life seemed to change on the surface. She still went to church. She still called me on Sundays to talk about her garden, which by that point had shrunk to 4 tomato plants and a stubborn rosebush that refused to die. She still seemed, in every conversation, entirely herself. It was a bank statement, an ordinary, unremarkable-looking piece of paper that told me otherwise. Margaret asked me to help her understand the new bank website one Tuesday afternoon in March. She wasn't confused. Exactly. She simply didn't trust her own reading of numbers on a screen the way she trusted them on paper. And old habits, for a woman her age, run deep. I told her I'd come by, print out her last 3 statements at the library on my way, and we'd go through them together like we used to when I was still working. I noticed the first irregularity before I even sat down. There was a recurring withdrawal, $600, cash, taken out on the 14th of every month for the past 8 months, from an ATM 22 miles from Margaret's house. 22 miles in a direction Margaret hadn't traveled, by her own account, in over 2 years, not since her hip surgery made long drives uncomfortable. She didn't recognize the withdrawals. She looked at the dates and genuinely, visibly, had no memory of the money leaving her account. Tyler must have needed it for something, she said. And I watched her say it the way people say things they've told themselves so many times they no longer examine them. He takes care of all of that. I didn't push. Not that day. 26 years in fraud investigation teaches you that the worst thing you can do, in the earliest moment of doubt, is alarm the person who's about to have their whole understanding of a relationship upended. You go slow. You gather. You make sure that what looks wrong is actually wrong before you say a word that can't be unsaid. So I asked Margaret, gently, if I could help her request a longer statement history 6 months back. Then a year, just to get organized, I told her. The way you'd offer to help anyone tidy their files. She agreed easily. She trusted me the same uncomplicated way she trusted Tyler. And it was that trust, more than anything else, that made me determined to be careful with it. What I found, over the following 2 weeks of quiet, careful review, was a pattern that no longer looked like coincidence. The $600 cash withdrawals continued monthly, going back 14 months, nearly the entire time Tyler had held the power of attorney. Alongside them, I found 3 transfers, each for just under $3,000, moved from Margaret's savings account into a checking account that did not belong to Margaret at all. It belonged to Tyler. The transfers were structured just under the amount that would have triggered the bank's automatic large transaction review, a detail that, to someone who spent 26 years watching for exactly this kind of pattern, was the loudest signal of all. Nobody accidentally structures a transfer to sit $98 below a reporting threshold. Not once. Certainly not 3 times. And there was more. Margaret's homeowner's insurance policy, which for decades had listed her as the sole named insured, had been amended 8 months earlier to add Tyler as a co-owner of the property, a change that, under most state laws, doesn't happen through a signature on a form alone. It requires notarization. I asked Margaret, as delicately as I knew how, whether she remembered visiting a notary that year for anything at all. She said no. She said it slowly, the way you say something once you've heard yourself say it and understood, for the first time, what it might mean. There was one more detail from that first pass through the year of statements that I almost missed. Buried between 2 of the larger transfers, a series of small, recurring charges, $11.99 each, billed monthly to a streaming service Margaret had never subscribed to and, when I asked her directly, had never heard of. On its own, it would have meant nothing. Against everything else, it told me something specific. Whoever was managing these accounts wasn't just taking money in emergencies or under pressure. They were comfortable in there. They'd set up a small, ongoing convenience for themselves and never bothered to cancel it. The way you don't think twice about a subscription you've decided, somewhere in the back of your mind, is simply part of your life now. That's often how you can tell the difference between a single desperate mistake and a pattern someone has settled into. The desperate mistake looks jagged, one-time, panicked. The pattern looks tidy. It looks like someone who has stopped being afraid of getting caught. I want to pause here and say something I believe deeply. Something I've believed since long before Margaret Doyle walked into my life. This is not a rare story. Elder financial exploitation, in the vast majority of cases, isn't committed by strangers running phone scans from call centers overseas. It's committed by family, by the people closest to the victim. The people with access, the people the victim has spent a lifetime learning to trust without question. That's not an accusation against families in general, it's the opposite. It's a reminder that trust, the very thing that makes a family, is also the thing that exploitation depends on completely. The people who do this count on you never checking. They count on love standing in for oversight. I didn't say any of that to Margaret that day. What I said was much simpler. I told her I thought something was wrong with her accounts, and that I thought we should look closer together before we said anything to Tyler at all. For the next 3 weeks, Margaret and I moved carefully. I helped her request full year of statements directly from the bank's fraud department, not as her banker, since I no longer worked there, but as a private citizen exercising the same rights any account holder has. I helped her understand what a forensic accountant does, and why, given what we'd already found, it might be worth hiring one before we did anything else. Tyler noticed. Margaret told me later that he'd found a printed bank statement on the kitchen counter, one she'd left out after a call with the fraud department, and asked her, in a tone she described as not like him at all, why she was looking into her own accounts when he already handled everything. She said he seemed less angry than frightened, and in hindsight, I think frightened is exactly right. A person confident in their own innocence doesn't panic at the sight of a bank statement. He told her the statement must be a bank error. He offered, that same evening, to clean up her online banking password because it was, he said, outdated and insecure, an offer that would have locked Margaret out of her own account entirely, routing all future access through credentials only he controlled. Margaret, to her enormous credit, told him she'd think about it, and called me the moment he left the room. This was the moment the investigation stopped being something we could take slowly. If Tyler changed the passwords, we would lose access to the very evidence we needed. If he grew suspicious enough to act, he could withdraw or transfer the remaining funds in a single afternoon, and there would be little anyone could do to recover them quickly. I called a forensic accountant I'd worked with years earlier, a woman named Priya Anand who specialized in exactly this kind of case, and asked her, as a personal favor, to review what we had within 48 hours instead of the usual 2-week turnaround. I called an elder law attorney, David Feynman, and asked him to prepare, on standby, the paperwork to revoke Tyler's power of attorney the moment we had enough documentation to justify it. And I told Margaret, as gently and as honestly as I could, that I believed we needed to move faster than either of us was comfortable with, because the alternative was giving Tyler more time. She didn't cry when I told her what I suspected in full. She went very quiet, and then she said something I've thought about often since. I keep looking for the version of this where I'm wrong, she said. But every time I look, it just gets worse. There was a moment, 2 days into that 48-hour window, when I genuinely thought we'd lost our chance. Margaret called me at 9 in the evening, her voice tight in a way I'd never heard from her before, to say that Tyler had come home early from work, and asked her, directly, whether she'd spoken to a lawyer. She told me she'd frozen, that she hadn't planned an answer for that question, and so she'd told him the truth. That she was just looking into some things, which was vague enough to be technically honest and specific enough. She was certain to have made him suspicious. I asked her to describe his reaction. She said he'd gone quiet, said okay in a flat voice, and gone up to his room, and that she'd heard him on the phone through the wall for almost an hour afterward. Though she couldn't make out the words, I didn't sleep much that night. I called David first thing the next morning and asked whether we had any legal mechanism to freeze the accounts before the petition itself was even filed, and he told me, honestly, that an emergency ex-parte order was possible but would require at least a preliminary version of Priya's findings to justify it to a judge on short notice. I called Priya and asked her, apologetically, whether 48 hours could become 24. She didn't say yes right away. She said she'd try, and then she worked through the night. And at 6 the next morning she called me with enough of a preliminary summary, not the full 11 pages yet, but enough to take to David, and David took it to an emergency duty judge that same afternoon. The freeze was granted 3 hours before, according to bank records we obtained afterward. A large transfer attempt from Margaret's remaining home equity funds had been initiated and rejected for insufficient authorization. 3 hours? I've thought about that margin more than almost anything else in this case. Within 4 days, Priya had completed a preliminary review of the full year of statements. What she found didn't just confirm what I'd suspected. It was worse. Priya's report ran to 11 pages, and I read every line twice before I called Margaret to explain it in person rather than over the phone. Some things you don't say to someone over the phone. Not when you've known them for 11 years. Not when you care about what happens to their face when they hear it. The total identified, over 14 months, came to just over $61,000. It came from 3 sources: the monthly cash withdrawals, the structured transfers into Tyler's checking account, and, this was the part that took my breath away, when Priya first laid it out, a home equity line of credit that had been opened against Margaret's house 9 months earlier. Margaret had never applied for it. She had never signed for it. And yet a signature bearing her name sat on every page of the paperwork. Notarized by a mobile notary service Tyler had hired to come directly to the house on a day Margaret later confirmed, through her own calendar, that she'd been at a doctor's appointment across town for most of the afternoon. The notary's records, which David, the attorney, subpoenaed as part of building the case, showed the appointment had been scheduled for 2:15 p.m. Margaret's medical records showed she hadn't returned home from her appointment until nearly 4 o'clock. The notarization was time-stamped to 22 p.m. Margaret Doyle had, according to the paper trail meant to prove otherwise, signed a legal document in her own kitchen at a time she was sitting in a doctor's waiting room 11 miles away. I sat with that fact for a long time before I told anyone. It is one thing to suspect a person you love has been taking money that wasn't theirs. It is another thing entirely to hold proof that they forged your name, the single thing that has always, legally and emotionally, meant this is really you. This is really your word, while you weren't even in the building. The home equity line had already been drawn down almost entirely, $42,000 of it gone, transferred in increments to Tyler's checking account over 6 months, the same account that had received the earlier structured transfers. Between the cash withdrawals, the transfers, and the fraudulent line of credit, Tyler had taken more than $100,000 from his grandmother in under 14 months, money that, Priya's report noted almost as an aside, roughly corresponded to a period during which Tyler had also purchased a used truck, paid off a significant credit card balance, and put a deposit on an apartment he told Margaret he was just looking at for someday. Margaret asked me, when I finally told her the full number, whether I thought Tyler had planned it from the beginning, whether the year of driving her to church and cooking Carol's recipes and crying with her at the kitchen table had been, in some calculated way, a setup for what came after. I told her the truth, which is that I don't know, and that I've learned over 26 years not to pretend certainty about another person's heart. Sometimes exploitation starts as a plan. More often, in my experience, it starts as a single moment of taking something that isn't yours because you tell yourself you'll pay it back, and then it doesn't get paid back. And the story you tell yourself about why gets a little more elaborate each time, until eventually the story requires forging a signature to keep itself alive. I don't think that makes it less serious. I think it might make it sadder. Grief and greed aren't opposites. Sometimes they live in the very same person, in the very same house, and the person living with both of them may not fully understand, themselves, which one is driving. What I did tell Margaret with total certainty was this: whatever Tyler's grief for his mother had been, it did not entitle him to her money, her house, or her signature. Love does not require someone to be robbed quietly and call it help. Priya's report included one more finding that I've never quite shaken. A small line item near the end of the 11 pages that she'd flagged almost as a footnote. 6 weeks before the home equity line was opened, Tyler had called the bank's customer service line from his own registered phone number and asked a series of questions about how power of attorney interacted with home equity applications, specifically whether a POA holder could apply on behalf of the account owner without the owner being present at signing, and what documentation a mobile notary would require. The call had been recorded, as all such calls are, and transcribed as part of Priya's request for records. He had asked those questions 6 weeks before he needed the answers. That single call did more to settle the question in my own mind than anything else in the file. Whatever this had started as, by that phone call, it had become something planned. We had what we needed. It was time to act. David filed the petition to revoke Tyler's power of attorney on a Thursday morning, along with a request for an emergency asset freeze on the remaining home equity funds and a formal report to Adult Protective Services, which under state law triggers a mandatory investigation into suspected elder financial abuse. Margaret asked to be present for the hearing herself, though David told her, honestly, that she didn't have to be. She said she wanted to look Tyler in the face when the judge read the findings. I understood why. I think I would have wanted the same thing. The hearing took place 3 weeks later in a small civil courtroom that smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee. Tyler arrived with a lawyer of his own, a young man who looked, to my eye, uncertain about the case he'd been asked to defend. Tyler himself looked thinner than the last time I'd seen him, at Margaret's 83rd birthday, when he'd stood up and made a toast about how his grandmother had saved him after his mother died. I remembered that toast very clearly, sitting in that courtroom. I don't think I'll ever fully separate the two images of him in my mind, the grandson crying at the birthday table, and the grandson whose forged signature sat in an evidence folder 3 feet away from me. Priya testified first, walking the judge through the financial records with the same clear, unemotional precision she'd used with Margaret and me. The forensic timeline was difficult to argue with, the structured transfers just under the reporting threshold, the cash withdrawals with no corresponding expenses in Margaret's own life, the notarization time stamped to a window when Margaret was documented by her own physician's office to be somewhere else entirely. Tyler's attorney tried, briefly, to suggest that Margaret might simply be misremembering her schedule, that memory at 84 is not always reliable, and that families often disagree about who authorized what. It was a reasonable line of defense in the abstract. It did not survive contact with the doctor's office records, time-stamped and dated, sitting in evidence beside the notary's own log. When it was Tyler's turn to speak, the judge gave him the opportunity. Though his attorney had advised against it, he didn't deny the money. He said he'd meant to pay it back. He said the truck had been necessary because his old car had failed inspection and he needed reliable transportation to keep working the job that let him stay home nights and weekends to care for Margaret. He said the apartment deposit had been a mistake, something he'd reverse within a week. He said, and this was the part of his statement that Margaret told me afterward she believed completely, that he loved his grandmother more than he had ever loved anyone, and that none of what he'd done felt, at the time, like stealing from her. It felt, he said, like taking an advance on something that would eventually be his anyway. I watched Margaret's face while he said that last part. I've thought about her expression many times since. It wasn't rage. It was something quieter and, I think, more painful, the particular grief of understanding that someone you love has, in their own mind, already decided how much of you belongs to them before you're gone. Margaret testified as well, briefly, near the end. David had prepared her carefully, told her she only needed to answer what was asked and nothing more. But when the judge asked whether she had anything she wanted to add, she looked at Tyler for a long moment and said something that wasn't in any of the preparation. She said, I would have given you anything you asked for. I don't understand why you didn't just ask. The courtroom was very quiet after that. Tyler didn't look up. I don't think there was an answer he could have given that would have made that moment easier for either of them. And to his credit, or perhaps simply out of exhaustion, he didn't try to give one. The judge granted the petition in full. Tyler's power of attorney was revoked immediately. The asset freeze remained in place pending a separate civil action to recover the remaining funds. And the Adult Protective Services report was formally referred, given the scale of the amount involved, to the county prosecutor's office to determine whether criminal charges for fraud and forgery would be pursued alongside the civil case. As of the time of this recording, that decision remains pending. Margaret did not ask Tyler to move out of the house that day. That decision, David told me afterward, would take her several more weeks to make. I won't pretend to fully understand a grandmother's heart in a situation like that, and I don't think it's my place to. What I can tell you is what she told me. The last time we sat together at her kitchen table, 4 tomato plants outside the window and a stubborn rosebush still somehow alive against every expectation. I keep thinking, Margaret said, that if I had just checked sooner, none of this would have gotten so big. I told her what I believe to be true, and what I've told a dozen families in situations like hers over the years. The checking was never the failure. The trust that made checking feel unnecessary, that was never a failure either. It was love, doing exactly what love is supposed to do. The failure, if there was one single failure in this story, belonged entirely to the person who decided that love was something to be spent. Tyler ultimately moved out 3 months after the hearing, into an apartment his own father helped him secure. He has not, as of this recording, repaid any portion of the money, though the civil judgment against him remains active and enforceable. And David tells me these cases can take years to resolve, sometimes through wage garnishment, sometimes through a settlement long after the emotional dust has settled for everyone involved. Margaret still attends church on Sundays. She has a new arrangement now, a professional fiduciary recommended by David's office, someone with no personal stake in her estate managing her finances with the kind of transparent, auditable oversight that should, frankly, have been in place from the very beginning, not because family can't be trusted, but because even the family that can be trusted deserves a system that doesn't rely on nobody ever checking. She still calls me on Sundays. We still talk about her garden. I've spent most of my career reading the numbers other people leave behind, the quiet arithmetic of a life, spread across statements and receipts and the small, structured transfers someone hoped nobody would ever add up. What I've learned, more than anything else, is that the numbers themselves are never the real story. They're just where the real story finally becomes visible after it's been happening, unseen, for months. Margaret Doyle didn't lose her grandson to a stranger, or a scam, or bad luck. She lost the version of him she believed into a slow, quiet decision he made and remade, month after month, each time telling himself it was smaller than it was. I think about that distinction often, because I think it's the one most people miss when they hear a story like this and assume it couldn't happen to anyone they love. It doesn't start with a stranger. It starts with someone who already has a key to the house. If there's one thing I hope you take from Margaret's story, it's this. Checking on the people who handle your trust isn't an accusation. It isn't a failure of love. It's the thing love should have been doing all along, quietly, in the background, so that if the day ever comes when someone decides your trust is something to spend, the numbers tell the truth before the damage becomes too large to undo. The last time I visited Margaret, she showed me something she'd started keeping on the counter by the phone, a small spiral notebook, the kind you'd buy for $1 at a drugstore, where she now writes down, in her own handwriting, every transaction the fiduciary reports to her each month. She doesn't have to do it. The oversight exists whether she writes it down or not. But she told me it makes her feel like the numbers are hers again, the way they used to be before she handed them to someone else and stopped looking. I think about that notebook more than I expected to. It isn't evidence of anything. It isn't proof, the way Priya's 11 pages were proof. It's just a woman, 84 years old, quietly taking her own life back one entry at a time. I think that might be the truest ending this story has. This has been Dark Life. Thank you for staying with Margaret's story until the end.